During a lecture at NYU Stern, a professor mocked China Miéville's business ethics, and Keanu Reeves' response left the entire class speechless. The lecture hall was packed, students shuffling in with notebooks and laptops ready for another tense economics discussion. Professor Grace, known for her sharp tongue and unapologetic critiques, wasted no time diving into the topic. Ethics in business. Her voice carried easily across the room, commanding the class's full attention. Her analysis started broadly: mismanagement, corporate greed, but soon took a more personal turn. "Let's talk about China Miéville," she said, a sly smile creeping onto her face. "A so-called intellectual whose ethics are as questionable as his metaphors." Nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd, but quickly faded as the professor pressed on. She criticized his ventures, calling them overinflated failures, and dismissed his leadership style as textbook narcissism. The tension in the room was palpable. Some students glanced around uncomfortably, while others stifled nervous laughs. But in the middle of the front row sat Keanu Reeves. He was quiet, his face calm, betraying none of the emotions that must have been boiling beneath the surface. A slight tightening of his jaw and a quick glance down at his notebook were the only signs he was affected. As Professor Grace continued, students whispered to each other, clearly uneasy. Everyone knew who was sitting there, but no one dared to look directly at him. The room seemed to hold its collective breath, waiting for what would happen next. Professor Grace's critiques escalated, her voice growing sharper with each pointed remark. "And let's not forget his so-called masterpieces," she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "A masterclass in how to overpromise and underdeliver." She dissected one of Miéville's controversial projects, a high-profile initiative that ended in failure, line by line, highlighting every misstep. "This is what you don't do if you want to succeed in business," she declared, her words punctuated by a hard slam of her marker on the podium. The room grew quieter. The scattered laughter from earlier had vanished, replaced by an awkward tension. Students fidgeted in their seats, casting sidelong glances at Keanu. They weren't sure whether to admire his composure or feel secondhand embarrassment on his behalf. A few were visibly uncomfortable, shifting in their seats as the professor's jabs became more personal. Keanu remained still, his hands resting on his notebook. His expression was unreadable, but his body language betrayed subtle signs of discomfort. A slight clench of his fist, a brief tightening of his lips. He stared at the professor intently, as if analyzing her every word. Professor Grace, perhaps emboldened by his silence, pressed on. "What's truly remarkable," she continued, "is how someone can fail so spectacularly and still brand themselves as a genius. It's a testament to the power of spin over substance." The classroom was so silent that the ticking of the wall clock seemed deafening. A few students dared to glance at Keanu again, as if to gauge whether he would respond. Some seemed to silently plead for him to stay quiet, while others leaned forward, curious to see if he would defend Miéville. And then it happened. Keanu shifted in his seat and raised his hand. The movement was small but electrifying. The tension snapped as every pair of eyes turned to him, and the room collectively held its breath. Even Professor Grace paused mid-sentence, clearly caught off guard. "Yes?" she asked, her voice measured but tinged with surprise. Keanu paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. But he wasn't finished. He leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped on the desk, and continued. "There's something else I'd like to share, if that's okay." His voice remained calm, but there was an unmistakable edge of determination. Professor Grace nodded, her expression unreadable, as if she were bracing for whatever he might say next. "My mentor taught me something else about success," Keanu said, his voice steady. "He taught me that behind every achievement, there's a team of people who made it possible. It's not just about one person. It's about everyone who contributed, who believed in the vision even when things seemed impossible." He glanced briefly around the room, his gaze sweeping over his classmates before returning to the professor. "That's something I've seen firsthand. Hard work, loyalty, resilience. Those are the values he instilled in us, and those are the things I try to live by." A few students shifted in their seats, their expressions thoughtful. Keanu's words struck a chord, not just because of their content, but because of the sincerity with which they were delivered. He wasn't defending Miéville out of blind loyalty. He was speaking from a place of genuine understanding and personal conviction. He then pivoted, his tone softening. "I understand that public figures like my mentor are open to criticism," he said, "and they should be. Criticism is part of accountability, but I think there's a difference between constructive criticism and using someone as a scapegoat for everything we think is wrong in the world. No one is perfect, and no one achieves anything alone. I think it's important to acknowledge both the flaws and the strengths in people, especially when we're in a position to influence how others see them." The classroom was still, the atmosphere charged with a mix of emotions. Keanu Reeves's words didn't just challenge the professor. They challenged everyone in the room to think more deeply about their own perspectives. Professor Grace's expression softened. She set down her marker and stepped out from behind on the podium. "You make a fair point," she admitted, her voice quieter now. "Perhaps I was too harsh in my critique. It's easy to focus on the negative, especially when discussing someone as polarizing as China Miéville. But you've reminded me that there's more to every story than just the headlines." Keanu nodded, his expression still calm. "Thank you for hearing me out," he said. The professor hesitated for a moment, then added, "And thank you for speaking up. It takes courage to do what you just did." For the first time that day, a small ripple of applause broke out in the lecture hall. It wasn't loud or boisterous, but it carried a weight of its own, a quiet acknowledgement of Keanu's poise and grace. The room was still buzzing with the aftermath of Keanu's calm but powerful response as the professor turned back to the podium. She glanced at him one more time, her usual sharp confidence tempered by something else: respect. Keanu sat back in his seat, his demeanor composed, but his impact lingered heavily over the room. It was then that Keanu did something unexpected. He raised his hand again. The professor paused, nodding for him to continue. "There's one more thing I want to say," he began, his voice steady but tinged with a subtle warmth. "I'm here as a student, just like everyone else. I'm here to learn, to grow, and to understand perspectives that are different from my own. And I want to thank you, Professor Grace, for challenging us. It's through these kinds of conversations that we find clarity, even if it's uncomfortable." The tension in the room eased slightly as students exchanged glances. Some smiled faintly, others nodded. Keanu's humility was disarming, breaking through the walls of bias and preconceptions that had hung over the discussion. Professor Grace seemed caught off guard again, but this time her reaction was softer. "You're right," she said, her tone more measured now. "Discomfort is where learning begins. I hope you all take that lesson to heart, not just about this discussion, but in life." As she turned back to the whiteboard, the lecture resumed, but the energy in the room had shifted entirely. Students who had once been nervously silent now felt emboldened to participate, asking questions and debating ideas with a renewed sense of curiosity. Keanu remained engaged but let others take the lead, quietly observing the discussion as it unfolded. By the time the class ended, the usual shuffle of students packing up their belongings felt heavier, as if no one wanted to break the spell of what had just transpired. Keanu stood, gathering his notebook, when a student approached him hesitantly. "Hey," she said, her voice soft. "I just wanted to say that what you said earlier, it really resonated with me. I think a lot of us needed to hear that." Keanu offered a polite smile. "Thanks. I think it's important to remember that there's more to every story than what we see on the surface." As more students gathered around him, offering quiet words of support or simply nodding in solidarity, Keanu's measured grace left an indelible mark. Even those who didn't speak to him directly couldn't deny the ripple effect of his words. Outside the classroom, Professor Grace stood by the door, watching as her students left. When Keanu passed, she gave him a small nod. "Thank you, Keanu," she said simply. "For what?" he asked, his expression genuinely curious. "For reminding me that even teachers still have a lot to learn," she replied. As Keanu stepped out of the lecture hall, the echoes of the conversation still lingered in his mind. He wasn't one to seek attention, but the quiet acknowledgement from his classmates had left him reflecting on what had just happened. For a brief moment, he paused in the hallway, adjusting the strap of his bag over his shoulder. The hum of student chatter filled the corridor, yet a few faces turned his way, offering small nods or quick words of encouragement. "Hey, Keanu," a male student called out, jogging to catch up with him. "That was impressive, man. Not many people could have handled that the way you did." Keanu shrugged, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "I just said what I felt needed to be said." The student chuckled, shaking his head. "Still, it takes guts. Anyway, thanks for standing up like that." He clapped Keanu on the shoulder before disappearing into the crowd. As Keanu walked toward the campus courtyard, he felt the weight of the moment beginning to lift. The crisp autumn air greeted him, and he breathed it in deeply, letting the tension ease from his chest. He found a quiet bench under a large oak tree, the shade offering a small escape from the buzz of campus life. While he sat there, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Pulling it out, Keanu Reeves saw a message from his mother. "Heard about your class today. Proud of you." A small smile broke across his face as he read the words. He typed back a quick response before slipping the phone away. Just as he began to relax, he heard footsteps approaching. Looking up, he saw Professor Grace standing a few meters away, holding a coffee cup in one hand and a folder in the other. Her expression was thoughtful, almost hesitant. "Mind if I join you for a moment?" she asked. "Of course," Keanu replied, gesturing to the empty spot on the bench beside him. She sat down, taking a sip of her coffee before speaking. "You know, I've been teaching for over 20 years, and I can count on one hand the number of times a student has challenged me like that. In a respectful way, I mean." Keanu tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady. "I wasn't trying to challenge you, Professor. I just thought the conversation could use a little balance." Grace chuckled softly, nodding. "And that's exactly why it stood out. You didn't come at me with anger or defensiveness. You spoke with clarity and conviction. That's rare, especially nowadays." She paused, her gaze drifting out toward the courtyard. "I wanted to thank you for that. You reminded me of something important today, that our words carry weight and that it's easy to forget the human element behind every critique." Keanu nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I think we all need that reminder sometimes, myself included." The two sat in companionable silence for a moment, the sounds of campus life carrying on around them. After a few moments of quiet, Professor Grace turned back to Keanu. "You know," she began, her voice softer now, "it's easy to stand at a podium and deliver opinions, especially when you're removed from the people those opinions might affect. Today, you reminded me why I became a teacher in the first place. To foster real dialogue, not just preach my perspective." Keanu glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "I think it's important to have those discussions, even if they're uncomfortable. But it's also important to listen. That's something my mentor always taught me. You don't have to agree with everyone, but you should try to understand where they're coming from." Grace nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on the courtyard as students passed by. "It's good advice," she said. "And for what it's worth, I'll be rethinking how I approach certain topics in the future. Today wasn't just a lesson for the students, it was one for me too." Keanu smiled faintly, appreciating her humility. "Thank you for saying that. It means a lot." She stood, adjusting the folder under her arm. "Well, I should get going, but I wanted you to know that what you said today, it mattered." "Thanks, Professor," Keanu replied, standing as well. "And thank you for giving me the chance to speak." As she walked away, Keanu remained by the bench for a moment, watching the campus bustle around him. A sense of quiet pride settled over him, not for defending his mentor, but for the way the conversation had shifted from confrontation to understanding. The ripples of that moment carried through the day. By evening, a few classmates reached out to Keanu, thanking him for what he'd said. Some even admitted they had misjudged him before, seeing him only as the protege of a controversial figure. Now they saw someone who was thoughtful, composed, and willing to stand up for his beliefs without tearing anyone down. For Keanu, the day wasn't about changing minds. It was about planting a seed. And as he packed his books for the next day, he hoped that seed would grow into something bigger. A reminder to always seek understanding, even in the face of criticism. If this story inspired you to think differently or encouraged you to seek understanding even in the face of criticism, don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more stories like this. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.